The ego is the system that runs your sense of self. It is made out of thought patterns, emotions, and behavioral loops, and the stories that try to hold it all together. Left unchecked, it creates endless existential searching, chronic disconnection, and the persistent sense that something is wrong. The goal of my videos is clarity, to see your identity and its contradictions for what they are, named precisely, to finally understand what it is that we're all running away from. Some people might be under the impression that I believe in a God, but I don't believe in any God whatsoever. God doesn't exist, and all clinging to a personhood of God is a fantastic illusion of the ego to cling to some ground of solid reality. But reality is absolutely empty of any singular central figure or central factor. There are causes and conditionings that have created the universe since the Big Bang that now codependently arise between all objects and all things. There's no personhood particularly designing anything at all, but everything is unfolding without a doer whatsoever. When I say in some videos that the universe is what you might call God, and that this is a force of awareness, then a lot of people will say that this comes extremely close to a theist interpretation of reality, and then they might call me a theist. And for the sake of this video, let me be the theist for you that disproves the existence of God, which is already the problem, right? How could you disprove something that needs to be proven first? You cannot prove the existence of God because all definitions always lose the essence of what it is supposed to prove. Most religious arguments are absolutely awful and they fall into a wide variety of policies. The typical one is just the watchmaker argument that says that because anything has been created, therefore there must be a creator, ignoring the fact that God himself then also would have been created. There are so many of these kind of logical arguments that end up being in a paradox. And you either then take the paradox and say that the paradox is what God is, or you say the paradox is evidence that there is no God because there is no ultimate reality and all realities are equally real. When I used to be a Christian, I used to believe in a God and I used to pray and I used to go to church. And then when I entered the rationalist community, all these beliefs about Godhood started to slowly fade away as I realized that there's so many things that are illogical about the Bible and what they preach. And also those who often practice the religion didn't gave me a good taste in my mouth. I can also call myself a theist without any problem whatsoever because none of these two identities really stick anymore. The distinction between belief and non-belief or God existing or not existing is kind of collapse within me because I'm experiencing the non-dual nature of experience all the time. Like in some way, you might say that if God exists, then it is me, which is just a way to say that if God exists, then it is existence itself. And the only way I know existence itself is through myself here right now. But I don't think that calling this God is actually reasonable. And it is more an egoic way of expressing something quite simple, which just means being human. Most usages of God are also in an egoic sense. Most people use the rationale of God to justify their own morality and then impose this morality onto others. God is one of the strongest identification mechanism insofar that if you are a person that believes in a God, deconstructing this usually brings you into a lot of emotional and psychological pain. And if you had any sort of notion that, yeah, a God exists, and then you go through a traumatizing event that you cannot kind of reason with, that seems so beyond what seems fair to endure, then oftentimes you get challenged with, yeah, your conviction for existence, or if existence really is a good thing, which is also called a dark night of the soul, which can take between a few hours to a few days to years or decades or an entire life. It isn't solved. And independent of if you call yourself a theist or an atheist, dark nights of the soul are always phases in your life where you stop believing in anything, stop trusting in everything. And it usually relates to some existential loss of faith in the goodness of reality itself. And this goodness with reality itself is the relationship that we also have with justice. Is reality a fair system, or is it an unfair system? And a lot of people, rightfully so, look at this world and say it is an unjust system, and therefore God cannot possibly exist, because then God himself would be unjust. And from this mental model alone, God is like an impossibility in the mind, because a just God would never unleash so much suffering onto this world, at least not according to the Christian view of a God, right, where he is benevolent, or benevolent and all-powerful. If you see that all the ways we have used the idea of God to control and manipulate others, then the idea of God might as well just be another word for ego itself, as if it is the most aggrandizing way for a human to project cosmic significance onto another person and then use this cosmic significance for their own gain. And then they don't even need to provide evidence for this cosmic claim, because all that needs to be done is to threaten you with eternal suffering or in eternal well-being. And if you don't follow what I say, well, then yeah, you're going to suffer for all eternity. And then we can even feel good about doing so, because we do so in the name of the all-powerful creator that we personally have access to. These are all the reasons why, not all the reasons, but these were some significant reasons why I fell out of the belief in God, because it clearly seemed to be the case that whatever this God thing is more psychological mechanism than anything external that you could possibly verify. And then the idea that there could be something personalizable, like almost humanizable about God, started to fall away, because in almost all religions, I think in all religions, humans were created in God's image. And it's this creation in God's image that makes us imagine God as an ego, as somebody who has an identity with self-reference, as if there is a self that exists, that, yeah, could possibly understand its own nature and then create consciously from this own nature. Now, if you follow Buddhist traditions, then there is absolutely no self to even do this in the first place. It requires some sort of primordial ego before the universe even existed in order to kind of reflect and create all of existence. But if the beginning of all time and space was just nothingness, then there wasn't even separation there to kind of reflect about what is going to be created. So it cannot even be a conscious act to just decide to create or not create. Existence becomes a codependent, arising phenomenon that has no end and no beginning and exists for no reason at all. God is also often the way humans cling to the notion of consciousness. Even if you're not a theist, you might believe that the universe is consciousness or awareness, and this is kind of the way you imagine God to be. And then you think, okay, it's consciousness and it is awareness that is the ground fundamental nature of reality. Consciousness is also no ground. It is not the nature of reality either. It is the clinging of the ego to believe that it could be immortal once it dies, because it clings to the notion of consciousness. But consciousness, the way we humans define it, is completely human-bound. It is our own brain's attachment to how we perceive as humans that we then define as consciousness. But to pretend that the fish and the human have any similarities whatsoever in the way their consciousness project their own reality is also a pretty bold assumption. There's an existence that you can find in the center that connects all of us, but then to go a step beyond and call this God ignores the real duality that exists between all people and objects. From here, I am not you and you not me. We are separate entities living our separate lives. Therefore, there are infinite separate entities and none of them can claim Godhood. Even God himself couldn't claim the ultimate Godhood, because even from the highest meta perspective, he would be one with all of its subordinate parts. Therefore, all subordinate parts make part of what God is, and he cannot have access to all of it simultaneously without collapsing into itself and becoming nothing again. Meaning that within duality, there cannot be a God, because all that exists are infinite parts of itself with no clear localizable center. Therefore, consciousness itself is also no ground to stand on. And it is very useful for psychological and ego integration to not look for a ground to stand on. To believe that God exists will always be a sort of attachment pillar that might not let you see the other side of the coin. All the ways in which God doesn't exist at all, and how it's a pure fabrication of a psychological ego clinging to a sort of sense of safety or destiny or justice or goodness, and that the freedom of reality, the fact that you just can hurt people if you want to, that you can act evil in this reality if you want to, shows how much of a godless place this is, how there is no ultimate unity that needs to be enacted, because yeah, it's within the separation that we can do everything that we want to do. This requires a lot of psychological willingness to integrate all of these existential fears that are attached to this line of thinking. People who are atheists find a lot of comfort in the fact that God doesn't exist, and their identity gets attached by the fact that God doesn't exist. And theists get attached by the identity that God does exist. So both versions of reality are within a duality that separate things between existence and non-existence, when the differentiation between existence and non-existence is precisely what keeps the ego alive. If you truly want to merge with pure reality itself, you must eliminate all dualities. The distinction of a godhood or non-godhood is also a duality. The distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness is also a duality. Can you find how all of these are actually the same? They are all just configurations of a perception that shifts and morphs endlessly. And even non-perception is part of the whole. If this liberates or makes you come in contact with some deeper fears within yourself that you feel like you want to explore and uncover, then check out my ego architecture audit in the link in the description. It can accelerate your path to true existential freedom. When you stop believing in God, or let's make it personal, when I stopped believing in God, I actually felt a ton of relief, because I understood how much or how many of my identity layers were trapped in this idea that there's some personal entity watching and judging over me. And when I started to see that all my fears of hell and all of these beliefs I had built through the Bible were utter illusions of my mind, and I found science and rationality as one of the cornerstones with which to orient myself in my life now, I felt a ton of grounding in my own existence. I felt so much more peace that I couldn't feel before. And then when I started to dive deeper and deeper into rationality and science, the emotional problems that I had and my existential philosophical problems that I had, yeah, shifted deeper and deeper into philosophy and trying to understand how I then can come or be at peace with all of this nihilism that all of a sudden I'm experiencing. Because God wasn't just about a belief in some sort of entity that created everything. It also was like guidance and compass and objectivity and meaning and some clear direction about what it means to be anything at all. And then when this isn't there anymore, then what is left is nihilism, which is a belief in nothing at all, that nothing has any value, any meaning, there's no direction, and there's no purpose entrenched in reality whatsoever. And you might also find your peace within that or comfort within that. But for me, this just brought me into a hole of deeper and deeper inaction for my life. Like I just didn't want to do anything. I thought that my own experience has zero value because nothing has fundamental value in existence. Now, when you dive deep enough, then the nihilism destroys itself, because then nihilism itself is also not meaningful. So the negative valence, meaning the negative experience that I had about nihilism, was kind of disproving nihilism as well, despite the negative valence being caused by nihilism. It was a recursive paradoxical loop. And then it eliminated the difference between a world full of meaning and a world without meaning. because the difference was always co-created within my own consciousness. The experience is what reality then becomes. In the same way that if you were born in an Islamic country, you likely would believe in Allah. And if you were born in a Christian country, you likely believe in Christianity. If you were born in a Hindu country, you likely would be a proponent of Hinduism, and so forth. And if this is the reason for why somebody ascends to heaven or goes to hell, then this would be really the luck of the dice, wouldn't it? But instead, what the luck of the dice really do is they create your own ego architecture and how you relate to existence. And if you want to understand the real core of existence, the only way you can do so is by deconstructing all of the belief structures and all of the mental models you have of how reality works. And if you haven't done so, this also includes your belief in God, because usually within the belief in God are a lot of things tethered from your own ego that are more projections than actually the nature of what reality is. And some people believe in the demagogue or demiurge. The demiurge is the right word. And they believe that God is basically kind of an entity that trapped people in this existence. And that there's kind of like this antagonistic framing of what God also could be. And I know a lot of people who are into deep misery. Like the misery is self-perpetuated because of the belief that they've been trapped here by a malevolent entity. And you can see how God here then becomes kind of this ego projection of hatred and frustration towards existence itself. And then the object of existence becomes kind of what God is. But instead of being a good entity, it becomes, the demiurge, which is just this buffoon who created the universe when it shouldn't have, and now you have to escape it. And this framing again creates a duality between the place you need to ascend towards and the place where you are right now. But if you have a reasonable mind about this, then you can never really ascend to this other place, because whatever ascends isn't you anymore, as you can only exist in this body from within. And if you transform shape, well, then it clearly isn't your body anymore, right? Something is transforming, something is changing. And believing that kind of your consciousness or God takes you onto his paradise is also a way the ego clings to some sort of notion that it cannot actually know. And all separation you do from what is really the case, which is always the physical reality that you find yourself in, which you can learn more from through reason and logic and understanding and introspection, and also very important, feeling, then you start to notice that the question about God pretty much resolves itself. And if you want to understand why I believe in a God as an atheist, then watch this video here.